Good morning. My name is Manny Prunty, and I'm a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings from PPIC's latest report, Factors and Future Projections for K-12 Declining Enrollment. The survey and event are supported with funding from the Sobrato Family Foundation. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, I'll first present some of the key findings from the report. Then I'll be joined by my colleague and report co-author, Julien Lafortune, and together we will discuss key takeaways and answer questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity. It does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And now, on to the presentation. So why does declining enrollment matter? First, what is declining enrollment? We define declining enrollment as a loss of enrollment over a specific time frame, and the enrollment measure we use is a census day enrollment, where census day is the first Wednesday in October. And declining enrollment matters because districts are funded per pupil based on average daily attendance. Our average daily attendance is calculated by the total amount of students, the total amount of days all students attend school divided by the total amount of instructional days in the school year. So a loss of enrollment would lead to a lower amount of students attending school, which leads to a loss of total funding, but not necessarily per pupil funding. And a loss of total funding leads to downsizing, which could mean downsizing of schools or staff, and it can be very inefficient with constraints such as school facilities and school staffing. So to understand how enrollment has changed over time, we look at the past trends provided by the California Department of Education. And we also look at the projected changes for enrollment, which is provided by the California Department of Finance and also the National Center for Education Statistics. And we look at these trends based on grade, demographics, county, and region. We're interested in examining potential causes of declines with a specific focus on demographic changes. We're also interested in how districts respond to these changes in enrollment, especially where past district declines have occurred, and if these districts have decided to close schools at a high rate, and how equitable are those school closures. So decline enrollment has fiscal impacts for the state through the school system. The state has the Prop 98 guarantee, which basically guarantees a baseline of funding for districts and schools regardless of enrollment. So we call this a silver lining, where if the budget remains constant or growing, this could actually result in more money per student. As enrollment decreases, less students in the system, while the amount of money in the system due to this Prop 98 guarantee remains relatively constant. The state also provides a hold harmless, which creates winners and losers. And this hold harmless basically allows districts to use previous year's enrollment size or the past 3-year average enrollment size for funding purposes instead of the current year's enrollment, which for a lot of districts has declined and will lead to lower funding. This creates the winners of the districts that are facing declining enrollment, but also creates the losers of those growing and stable districts that would therefore receive less, since the enrollment that they will be using for funding purposes will be lower than their current enrollment that has grown. And it's also inefficient because we are funding students that are no longer in the system, since enrollment is based on previous years where enrollment was higher and more students were in the system. Those dollars are not going to those students anymore. So for this graph, I'm showing you how enrollment has changed over time. So first, starting in 1980, we see that the enrollment size is at 4 million students, and it grows all the way to the 2000s, ends up at 6 million students, then plateaus all the way up until about 2018-19, which is then when we start to see the decline. So the decline did start pre-pandemic, but the pandemic did exacerbate the decline, as you can see in the change in the slope of the graph. And then if you look at the yellow dotted line, this is the projection for the Department of Finance. So they project a continued decline, even though they also project a plateau from 2020 to 2024. And then the National Center for Education Statistics projects an even larger, steeper decline all the way up until 2030. So we're also interested in the regional differences in terms of how enrollment has changed over time. So here I'm comparing the projected 10-year change by region, comparing that to the past 10-year change by region. So for the past 10 years, only 3 regions have seen an increase in enrollment, and they're all in the Central Valley. Compare that to only 2 regions that are expected to see increase in the next 10 years, which is the Sierra region and the Northern Valley region. And overall, you can just see if you compare the orange bars to the blue bars, the orange bars are much more negative. And this just shows that in the next 10 years, the projected declines are much higher than the past declines. You can definitely see this with the greater Los Angeles region, which is projected to see a 20% decline. Another finding that we found interesting was that counties with more English learners expect larger declines. So here I'm showing, again, the past 10-year decline versus the projected 10-year decline, but I'm showing it by quartiles in terms of the English learner shares. So the first quartile are the counties with the lowest amount of English learner shares compared to other counties. And then the fourth quartile have the highest EL shares. So you can see in the first quartile, those counties are expected or projected to have an increase in enrollment over the next 10 years. And if you compare this to the third or fourth quartile, both quartiles are expected to have over a 10% decline in the next 10 years, which just shows counties with higher English learner shares are projected to have a much higher decline in the future years. And here another thing that we found interesting was that enrollment has fallen more among students who have ever been English learners. So here I'm just showing enrollment over time, with the first category being to our left, and it's English only and initially fluent. So these are the non-English learners. And you can see that enrollment for this group has remained relatively constant, absent the decline after 2020 into 2021. But since it has remained relatively constant, we move over to the right to the current and former EL category. And you can see they also had that dip after 2019-20, but they are still seeing a decline after that, and a more substantial decline relative to the non-English learners. And a narrative of why public school enrollment has decreased was that some, possibly students were going to private school. So in this graph, I'm showing you the change in enrollment compared to 2004, 2005, and that's basically when the year public school enrollment peaked. And you can see that for this orange line, public school enrollment, that's showing you, the drastic change or the drastic decline in public school enrollment since then. And then in this dark blue line, I'm showing you the change in private school enrollment. So up until 2019, private school enrollment has seen a decrease since 2004, 2005. However, during the pandemic, it did see a relative increase in their enrollment. And this is also true for homeschool. So we find that private school did account for some of the change in the public school enrollment system. However, it only accounted for about 9 to 10%. So it had a small role to play in the change. What we find had the main role or larger role in the change in enrollment were demographic factors. One of them being the change in birth rates. So for this graph, I'm showing you the total fertility rate over time, where the total fertility rate is basically the amount of births per couple. And we would like to see it be 2 or more, or 2 being the replacement rate. And we've basically been below 2 since 2008, or since the start of the Great Recession. And the Department of Finance projects that it will continue to be low all the way up until 2040. So this leads to a lower enrollment because it's just less births and less children basically replenishing the cohorts that are going into our school system leading to continuously lower enrollment sizes year after year. So now in terms of district level responses, we found that districts facing declines rarely close schools. So at this point, more than 70% of districts are facing declines, and school closures are fairly uncommon. So even when declines are 10% or more, which is like the highest change or highest decline, only less than 40% of those districts facing those declines close schools. And in fact, schools closed by districts have lower test scores, so it could possibly be a benefit for these school closures to occur. However, we do find some equity concerns once we look at districts with relatively higher economic division. And we define economic division as gap between the average share of free and reduced price meal students across the district compared to the school with the highest share of free and reduced price meal students. So you can see on the vertical axis, I'm showing you the percentage difference between the closed school versus district average. So the districts with a higher economic division tend to close the schools with a higher share of free and reduced price meal students and a higher share of high need students compared to the districts that have relatively lower economic division. So moving on to policy recommendations, our first policy recommendation is we think that it's important for the state to provide greater assistance and information to districts on effective and efficient downsizing. We found that larger school districts typically were more well-resourced and better equipped to project out their budget and project out their enrollment for multiple years, and were thus better suited to handle downsizing, to handle the decisions that come with declining enrollment. So we think that it may be helpful for the state to provide a roadmap for smaller districts that aren't as well resourced, and especially those districts that are projected to have substantial declines. And possibly it might even be helpful for those districts to implement or to require them to project out their budget for 5 years instead of 3 years, so that they'll be more well suited to make the decisions that come with declining enrollment. The second policy recommendation we have is prioritize equity in decisions on school closures so that they do not disproportionately affect high need students. And a way to do this is to ensure that the high need students that are a part of the schools that were low performing, that are usually low performing, that are ones that are usually closed, I should say, to ensure that they are then benefiting from that school closure. We think that it would be helpful to ensure that they have spots in the more higher achieving schools, and potentially eliminate the transition costs by maybe providing more transportation, more bus routes to those schools that will most likely be further away from their home school that might have been closed down. And lastly, we think that the state should avoid insulating districts from enrollment declines through additional funding. And this is specifically focused on the hold harmless, where the hold harmless is a temporary cushion. We feel like it's unsustainable. And excuse me, instead of delaying the inevitable due to these demographic factors, such as birth rate that doesn't seem to be increasing anytime soon, we think that instead the funding for that hold harmless should be focused more permanent sources of per pupil funding that are focused on our most needy students. And with that, I will give one more reminder to submit any questions you have to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I will invite my colleague and report co-author, Julien Lafortune, to come and discuss key findings from the report. Welcome, Julien.
Thanks, Manny. And thanks, everyone. And appreciate all the detail in the presentation, Manny. I guess before we get to Q&A, we'll discuss a little bit some of the takeaways we had in the report that we didn't get to in the presentation. One I wanted to start with was talking a bit more about school closures. So we did find, as Manny mentioned, that at least to date, when we look over, recent decades, school closures aren't the most common response to declining enrollment in districts. They tend to lower the amount of enrollment in their schools rather than, say, closed school sites specifically. But with that said, we haven't seen really the kind of extent of declines that are projected yet. And so, if the projections kind of come to pass and with these big declines through 2030 and even continuing over the next decade, if you look even further at what's projected demographically, it seems that that could become inevitable, or at least a decision point that, will be kind of force districts' hands at some point. So then the question becomes how best to do this, right? And so Manny mentioned we have these schools that closed, and when they were, in these kind of stratified districts with big socioeconomic differences, it tended to be the schools that had higher shares of high need, English learner, low income students, but also schools that had lower test scores as well. And so that could be a mixed bag, right? Some of these schools that had lower test scores, to the extent that students move to higher performing schools, could be better. But that depends on exactly the mechanism of how these closures happen. And we haven't seen a lot of these yet, so we don't have great research from California. But when we look at other contexts, one thing that we did dig into is that the research is pretty mixed on school closures when it comes to students seeing gains if they move. And really, it depends if they're moving to higher performing schools. And it also depends at the time frame that you look at, because there are transition costs, as Manny mentioned, to switching schools. And so really what we recommend, and just want to reiterate that, paying careful attention to these transition costs and the populations that will have to bear these transition costs, we think is going to be, populations and neighborhoods as well, because as schools are part of a community, is really going to be key as we get into this next decade or two, where a lot of school districts will be faced with tougher decisions that may require closing, multiple school sites depending on the size of the district. So that's just something that wanted to bring a little bit more context to, because we think that was kind of an important aspect of the report. One thing also that I think we didn't get a chance to talk about as much, and maybe Manny, you could elaborate. You talked about the English learner student changes at the county level, and also looking at at current and former English learners statewide. What other demographic changes are correlated with the projections we see, or whether their demographic characteristics are correlated with what we project over the next decade?
Yeah, so we also looked at counties with higher shares of Black, Asian, Latino students, and we saw that counties with high shares of Black, Asian, Latino students are expected to see higher declines compared to counties with relatively lower shares. And it's a pretty substantial disparity where the counties with high shares of those students are expected to see about 11% decline in the next 10 years, compared to a 7% decline for the counties with relatively lower shares of those students. And we also saw that counties with higher shares of white students expect to see much lower declines than counties with relatively low shares of white students. So counties with high share of white students are expected to see a decline, not necessarily increase, but a decline of only about 2%, compared to counties with relatively low shares of white students are expected to see, again, 11% decline in the next 10 years. But I do think it's important to note, too, that we don't see a noticeable difference between counties with high shares of low-income students versus counties with low shares of low-income students versus counties with high shares of low-income students. Both are expected to see substantial declines over the next 10 years, which I found pretty surprising.
Yeah, that's something that when we first saw that difference, I think surprised us, given the racial differences that we see in what's projected, as Manny mentioned, and the correlation with income. We might have expected to see more of a relationship there, but it's pretty much the same kind of consistent story, pretty substantial declines in places with a lot of low-income students and places without as many low-income students. And that might reflect that low-income students are more spread out throughout the state. But that's something that certainly is worth digging into more when it comes to the complex interplay between race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
One more thing while we have time that I think was worth digging into a little bit is on the fiscal side and the fiscal implications. So maybe Manny, could you add a little bit more? I think you kind of covered it at the beginning, but just kind of reiterate this distinction that we think is really important between total and per pupil funding changes when we look at districts in decline.
Yeah, I think it is a really important distinction because while declining enrollment is expected to lead to lower total funding for the system and for districts, um, it could possibly lead to higher per pupil funding. It's almost a Malthusian aspect of it where since students are leaving the system and Prop 98 guarantees a minimum level of funding, that minimum level of funding is not going to change regardless of students leaving the system or not. So now there's the same amount of dollars just going to a lower amount of students. So that's going to lead to possibly lead to a higher amount of per pupil funding, given that the budget remains constant and that it continues to grow, which we hope it does. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of budgetary uncertainty now, of course. So, again, big grains of salt there. But over the long term, it could be, if enrollment declines kind of outpace, inflation adjusted size of the budget, then we could have this situation where there's more money in the overall K-12 system. And I think, in our recommendations, avoid kind of further insulating are really about, well, what do we do with this extra cushion if we have it? Given that so many districts and so much of the state is declining and continues to see further declines, really finding ways to effectively downsize the system rather than just kind of hold on to previous levels of overall funding, I think will be really key. It's not something like the COVID situation where we have very discrete drops that are driven by outside, kind of maybe more one-time factors. Some of that was private school, some of that was homeschooling, and students being kind of redshirted in early grades, so to say.
Yeah.
But I think, the declines we're seeing are really more about demographics over the
Yes.
long term, or at least what's projected. One more thing, I think, while we have time before questions, Q&A, I see a couple coming in. But in this report, we looked at enrollment, and as Manny mentioned, its funding is really based on ADA, or average daily attendance. And so we didn't really cover attendance in this report, but it's an incredibly important issue right now. So Manny, you've done some other work on attendance and absenteeism. Just wondering if you could kind of provide some of the context there about what the situation is there, how it's changed recently, and how we can think about that in this context.
Yeah, exactly. As you mentioned, funding is based on average daily attendance, which is indirectly based on enrollment, but directly based on attendance. And we saw that chronic absenteeism. We found that chronic absenteeism has skyrocketed since 2018-19, since the pandemic. In 2018-19, the amount of chronically absent students were about 750,000. And in 2021 to 22, it skyrocketed all the way to 1.8 billion students. And these are students that are missing 10% or more of the school year. So while it has the same implications in terms of the same funding implications as declining enrollment does, it also has direct student implications, student level effects as well, where we find that chronic absenteeism, chronically absent students tend to, perform worse academically, are less connected to the school socially, and that leads to social emotional learning impacts as well. And we also found that there was a snowballing effect where if a student was chronically absent in kindergarten or in the early grades, they tend to be excuse me, more likely to be chronically absent in the later grades as well. So it is extremely important, and it seems that even in this most recent year, it's down to about 1.5 million students. That's still double the amount of 2018-19. So it's coming down slowly, but it's extremely important to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I mean, a lot of progress compared to last year, but still a shockingly high number when we compare it to where we were at pre-pandemic.
Exactly.
So with that, we'll turn to questions, audience Q&A, and just as a reminder, again, we'll kind of put the slide up. If you have questions, please send them to our email address here, PPIC event questions@gmail.com. So we'll start with the first question here. And maybe Manny, I don't know if you have thoughts on this one. So could the change in the English learner population be driven by the changes in identification and reclassification policies during COVID?
Yeah. So during COVID, I'm aware of specifically during the 2020 to 2021 school year, the testing window for the LPAC got pushed back because of all the troubles that came with the pandemic for districts. And then so this actually caused a kind of a discrepancy with the English learner numbers in that for that specific school year, because they no longer use the census day counts. They had to use the cumulative day count or the cumulative counts because they extended the testing window. So there was a discrepancy in that year. I'm aware of that. However, just if you think back to the graph, that decline continued even past that year, even when we basically returned back to the normal LPAC testing schedule, to the normal, counts, to the normal census day counts. That decrease for our English learners still continued on. So I think it impacted that specific year, but didn't continue on. What do you think, Julien?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see there's a big drop right at the pandemic and a lot of kind of TBD classification of students when it comes to their language classification, but the trend continued after that. So there's, some of what we saw maybe rate in 2020, 21 was due to these disruptions, as Manny talked about, but the trend has continued afterwards. And when we look overall, at the total population of multilingual learners, current English learners, as well as those who have been reclassified from English learner status, that student group both as a share of the student population and overall has been in decline at a little bit faster rate than the share of English only or kind of initially fluent students.
Yes, exactly.
So turning to a similar question now, this is from Ana Gonzalez Cifuentes from Roseville Joint Union High School District. What is the projection of students who are English learners? Is there an increase, decrease, or stagnant growth? And I guess I can start off with this, and it relates to what we were just talking about. When we look statewide, we've seen faster declines among the kind of population that's ever English learner. So those who either entered as English learners and continued or have been reclassified. I think, and then so that certainly suggests there'll probably be a larger decline. Some of that is based on the regions that we see larger declines projected. So a lot of the big declines are projected in the coastal regions of the state, particularly in LA and Southern California. Some of the largest declines, which is the area with the largest population of English learners. And so we think that's really the regional aspect, as well as changes in birth rates between first and second generation immigrants, which have changed more drastically than among the native-born population, which we talked about a little bit in the report, but that's something that could be kind of underlying the trend even within regions as well. I don't know, Manny, is there anything else to add on that?
No, I think you hit it right on the head. Yeah, and I think it also relates to our next question as well.
Yeah, okay. So here from San Francisco, so why are some regions growing in population despite predictions that declining enrollment will affect the whole state in the next decade?
Yeah, so and I could take this question on. Similar to what Julian said, it is a regional thing where we find that it's even interstate migration where people are migrating from coastal counties into more central counties. This is especially true for the Sierra region, which is one of the two regions I was expected to increase over time. We just think that a lot of the people from the Bay Area, frankly, are migrating to the Sierra region. It could be a cost of living thing. It probably is a cost of living thing. But so that's one of the reasons. Another reason is in these central counties, central regions, especially in the Central Valley, their birth rates were just higher. So it goes back to demographic factors. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it is the demographic factors that are really leading these changes in enrollment. So in the Central Valley, they did have higher birth rates. And this could, again, go back to a migration story as well, where, first and second generation immigrants are much more likely to have higher birth rates than the native born population.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. One other thing we'll add too is when we're thinking about population of children versus overall population of a region, California's population is aging, and that's generally true across most regions. And part of that is birth rates, and this is just in some ways a reflection where we may end up in some regions where even the region itself could be growing, but there could be fewer kids overall in the system, public and private, when we add it up together. Moving on to the next question, Manny, this is back to chronic absenteeism. So maybe you have some thoughts here. This is from Teresa Austin from the Office of Senator Allen. Is there any data on whether chronic absenteeism has been concentrated or seen, rises in certain grade levels before the pandemic and beyond? And is it evenly observed across grade levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is it is not evenly distributed across grade levels. It is extremely focused on the early grade levels, especially in kindergarten and first grade. And pre-pandemic, kindergarten and the early grade did see a slightly higher chronic absenteeism rate compared to the overall chronic absenteeism rate. But now it's much more higher than the overall absenteeism rate. So, for example, as it sits now, the chronic absenteeism rate in the entire state, excuse me, across all grade levels is 25%. But in kindergarten, it's close to 40%. So it's very much concentrated in kindergarten, first grade, which is why I thought it was really important to highlight the snowballing effect, where if these students are coming into the system, coming into school, are already chronically absent, they're much more likely to be chronically absent in the next grades as well. We really have to focus on kindergarten when we're trying to attack the chronic absenteeism problem.
Yeah, that's great. And when we're looking beyond absenteeism and thinking about the ADA and the declining enrollment picture overall, it's kind of a double whammy in these early grades because that's where we saw a lot of the enrollment decline recently, as well as during the pandemic. And has been, that was kind of those were the grades where the declines were much worse than what was projected demographically.
Yes, exactly. And another thing too, where we're looking forward to the expansion of TK as kind of like a saving grace in saving enrollment numbers, because these year-over-year changes, this past year the expansion of TK, we find that was one of the biggest reasons why the drop in enrollment was so small. However, if a lot of these students that are enrolled are chronically absent, it kind of almost mitigates the increase in enrollment.
Yeah, and that's definitely a concern. So actually kind of a similar question here, sort of to what I was mentioning about projections, but how accurate have projections been in the past? And this is, I can, I guess, take the first stab at this. I guess and this is our colleagues at the Department of Finance do a great job putting out these projections, and it's inherently, an effort that faces a lot of uncertainty. We've looked at this in the past, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you look at past projections and kind of stack them up over time, it's tended to be the case that they're less, they're more accurate when you're projecting out over the next 5 years than say 10 or 15 years. And they're fairly accurate within 5 years in many cases. And that's because the number of students who are both currently in the system and are progressing their way through, as well as the number of kids who have already been born. And so there's a little bit more certainty there. Of course, with big changes in migration, that can change things. But one thing we've seen, and there's no reason that this would necessarily have to be the case going forward, but when we've looked at past projections, they've tended, at least from, looking at the kind of declines we've seen over the last 5, 6 years, the past projections have been a little bit more optimistic than what's actually occurred in most years. And so if that trend continues, then, what we're looking at the end of the decade and into the 2030s could be, perhaps a little bit more optimistic than what might actually occur. Of course, this isn't, the projections are projections and they're just that, and there's a lot that could change. And there's certainly a lot of economic and, migratory changes that are happening in California that will determine that. But something to keep in mind, the federal projections that we've looked at, which aren't as in tune with California specific information and data, or they're done by the Federal Department of Education, but they actually project a little bit lower enrollment by the end of the decade than the State Department of Finance does for California.
Yeah, and for those federal projections too, it seems like they're not, completely incorporating the TK change as well, the TK expansion, so that could possibly be why they're a little bit more pessimistic when it comes to enrollment changes. But yeah, I completely second what you said about the Department of Finance kind of underestimating the declines over time, especially in the early grades. But if you just collapse it all in terms of like the overall change in the state, they've been pretty accurate.
Great. So moving on, we have another question. What does good planning look like for a district that is facing declining enrollment? So I guess I'll give it. I can give this the first stab, and we didn't do as much of this work in this report, but in the report we did a few years ago on declining enrollment, we actually did some interviews with districts and county offices of education to try to understand, best practices. And what the most consistent thing we saw in districts that seemed to have a good handle on declining enrollment was both, a kind of robust institutional culture around projecting the budget forward and taking seriously, projections and 3 and 5 year budgetary outlooks, as well as the capacity to be able to do so and have accurate demographic numbers. So districts that, were smaller or didn't have demographers or analysts that could do demographic projections on staff, or weren't able to contract that out, just didn't have as good of information. And so those 3 and 5 and even 7 year budget outlooks just aren't going to be as realistic and as useful. So I think that's something that's really key, just being projecting forward, so that you can adjust gradually rather than have to adjust all at once. And in districts that aren't as large and don't have the capacity to do this themselves, we think there's something where the state could provide some more guidance or information that could really help districts make some of these what are difficult choices, but at least be most informed to make the choices in ways that at least disrupt student services.
Yeah, I completely agree.
All right, and I guess we'll take the last question here. And this is, I guess, a little bit of a loaded one, but are school closures, could they be a good option to consider if a school is struggling due to declining enrollment?
Yeah, so school closures, it's really a double-edged sword, because while school closures might seem like the sensible decision in terms of trying to cut costs, in terms of the school being there, you still have to retain the staff, you still have to relocate the students, relocate the staff, and there are a lot of transition costs, not only for the student, but also for the district, that kind of cuts against that cost-saving mechanism. So while it could be good, for the district in terms of cutting costs slightly, it could also be good as well for the student, where if it's a lower performing school, the student could then be relocated to a higher achieving school. So it could be possibly good for the student, but again, at the same time, the disruption of closing the school for the neighborhood and on the student really also hurts the benefit of closing the school has, or then relocating the student could have. So it's really a give and take with school closures. We also found in previous research that we read, that possible, a possible result of school closures is the district, renting out that space for funding purposes, and that could also be a helpful or so-called good decision for them as well. So it's kind of complicated.
Exactly. I think on the fiscal side, it really depends. The savings aren't necessarily so great because, as Manny mentioned, you still have staff and students that have to, are employed, or students that have to be taught. So those have to, you can't cut those costs. It really depends on what's done with the facility, and are you able to recoup some cost, or does the facility just sit there? And so with that, I see that we're at time. And so again, just want to thank Manny for the presentation. And I'd also, again, like to thank our funder, the Sobrato Family Foundation, for supporting both this research and today's program, as well as thanking every one of you who joined us online for your participation, and those who asked us questions digitally. The only other announcement is just, if you pre-registered for the event, later today, you'll get a survey. And we'd really appreciate if you could take a couple minutes out of your day and just respond to the survey and let us know, how we did with this event, or if you have any thoughts on, things that could improve future events. So with that concludes our presentation, and I would like to thank you and hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.